Yo, yo, yo! What's up, everybody? It's your boy, Mr. Pete. Today we're going to start Unit 2, the living world, biodiversity. We spent a while talking about sort of the basics of ecology, and now we're going to dive a little bit deeper looking into this topic, biodiversity, and some more advanced ecology. First of all, what is biodiversity? Why is it so important? Why should I care about it? And how are we going to measure it? Which is an important question that is actually quite difficult to answer. So biodiversity is a pretty simple concept. It's the variety of life on Earth. How many unique different species are there on Earth? From plants to animals, fungi, bacteria, you name it. But there are three scales of biodiversity that are important to distinguish. The smallest scale is genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is the genetic variation among a population, the uniqueness of your DNA. A population is just a group of individuals of the same species, right? You can see a map in the background here. The skin colors based on where you live in terms of indigenous populations for humans around the world. This is one example of genetic diversity in human populations, but there's genetic diversity in all organisms, animals, plants, you name it. And genetic diversity is super duper important because it's going to allow populations to respond to different stressors in the environment. It could be physical stress, like a variety of abiotic factors. It could be heat or temperature. It could be moisture. It could be salinity. It could be pH. You name it, right? Changes in abiotic factors are going to require individuals to adapt, move, or die. The same can be said for natural disasters like wildfires, like we're seeing on the West Coast, pollution or radiation, changes in climate, new diseases that pop up, and then also biological pressures that we talked about, predation, competition, parasites, or even the lack of mates. So genetic diversity is going to increase the ability of a population to respond to these types of events and be a little bit more flexible. And that's why I say that it's the fuel for evolution. And I don't mean evolution like in Pokemon, I mean like natural selection or Darwinian evolution, something we'll talk a little bit about later. But for example, the genetic diversity in the spots and colors of giraffes make subtle differences that might have an impact on their fitness and their ability to survive, which is basically the evolution in a nutshell. There's a unique event or phenomenon that occurs with genetic biodiversity, and it's called the bottleneck effect, which is basically this idea that if we've got an original population, and you can see the genetic diversity represented by the different colors of balls, a bottleneck effect is when that population is reduced in size, right? It's gone through a bottleneck. And the surviving population grows back into a new population, and you can see the distribution of colors is very different than when we started. The genetic diversity has changed because the gene pool was altered, right? The distribution was changed. Yellow is a much smaller representation in this new gene pool. And that bottleneck effect can be seen in a variety of examples. I'll show you one in a bit. Anything can cause a bottleneck effect, anything that's going to reduce the size of the population and ultimately the gene pool. It could be pollution, an earthquake, a volcano, a river eroding away a canyon over time. It could be sudden, it could be rapid, or it could take a really long time. One of the most famous examples is the bottleneck effect of the American bison in the western United States during the 19th century. In 1870, there were about 60 million bison, and 15 years later, due to hunting, there were only about 100 left. Here's a picture of some pioneers standing on a pile of bison skulls. And then about 17 years later, that population of 100 was down to 25. Thankfully, due to conservation and restoration efforts, that population has been boosted back up to 500,000, so bison are better. The population is substantially larger, but their gene pool has shrunk, right? Think of all the genetic variation that existed among these 60 million bison. But at some point, that population was reduced down to 25. And that population of 25 is going to have much less genetic biodiversity, meaning that the population that arose from that 25, that 500,000 came from somewhere, it came from these 25 bison. This population is going to have a very different and probably more limited gene pool. The second level of biodiversity is species diversity. We're moving up in terms of hierarchy. And this is probably what you think of when you think of biodiversity. It's just the number of different species in a region or habitat, in a community, in an ecosystem, etc. So all of these are different species. They all contribute towards species biodiversity. A species is categorized based on its ability to interbreed and produce offspring that survive and can themselves breed. There are about 2 million species that we've cataloged on Earth. We predict that there are about 10 million. We catalog about 15,000 new species per year. This fact is going to blow your mind, because it blows my mind every time I think about it. Of the 2 million species we've cataloged, about 1 million of them are animals. That's about a half are animals. And of those million animals, half of them are insects. Okay? And of those million animals, a third are beetles. A third of all species of animals are beetles. 300,000 or so, 333,000 species of beetles alone. That's a lot of beetles. Anyway, that's pretty cool, I think. And species biodiversity is really important because it's going to increase an ecosystem's ability to, again, respond to different environmental stressors, right? Take a look at this food web, or food chain, and take a look at this food web. If I pull out the snake from this food chain, right, we're going to see a significant trophic cascade, right? The hawk is going to start running out of food, the mouse population will explode, grasshoppers will go down, and as a result, the plant population will explode, right? Whereas in this food web, which has much higher species biodiversity, if I remove one of these organisms, there's enough redundancy on these different trophic levels. We've got a couple consumers on each level that they can kind of pick up the slack of whoever's missing, let's say. So let's say the western whiptail is removed for some reason. Well, he eats pika, red-breasted nuthatch, Pacific tree frog, and Edith's checker spot. Well, there's a bunch of other organisms that eat all those foods that can help keep the population in check, right? So because of the species biodiversity, this ecosystem is going to be more resilient to things like trophic cascades, but also more adaptable in general to various environmental changes. The last level of diversity is habitat diversity. You can kind of think of this like different biomes, right? The variety of habitats that are going to exist within a given area. It can be on a little bit more of a smaller scale than biomes in some cases, but don't lose sleep over distinguishing it from biomes. But an interesting phenomenon we see with habitat diversity is that as habitat diversity goes down, as we lose habitat, we tend to see the loss of specialist species, followed by then the loss of generalist species. And before I explore that phenomenon, I need to define these things for you. A specialist species is one that has a very, very specific niche. Okay, maybe it only eats one type of food, like a panda only eats bamboo, a koala only eats eucalyptus. Steve Jobs, for the last 7 years of his life, only ate fruit. You can look that up. I'm pretty sure that's true. Or maybe they live in a very small range of space, right? Koalas only live in Australia, pandas only live in certain areas of China, right? So they have very specific needs. They've specialized on that niche. They've specialized on the food, on the habitat. To contrast that, our generalist species, these species can live anywhere, they can eat anything, right? Think like a coyote, they live all over the place, and they eat whatever they can get their hands on. Same with deer and trash pandas, right? They eat a lot of different things, and they can thrive in a variety of different conditions, biotic conditions and abiotic conditions. So they can outcompete a lot of different organisms, and they can deal with a lot of different physical stresses like salinity or moisture or heat. So now that we understand the difference between specialists and generalists, let's explore this phenomenon. As habitat diversity goes down, we see the loss of specialists, followed by then the loss of generalists. We're going to do that by looking at habitat destruction in the Amazon rainforest, much of which is being done to raise beef, cattle, but also to grow soybeans to feed the beef. Here's an image of some habitat fragmentation going on in the Amazon. So in the Amazon rainforest, right, what's going to happen when we start losing that habitat biodiversity is that the specialists are going to die off first because they have a very limited range in which they can survive. And if you start messing with that, they're going to struggle quickly, right? There are species like the eye, which eats grubs only, and the anteater, which obviously eats ants. These guys, the second that their habitat is messed with, they're going to have much less real estate where they can live, where they can hunt, and where they can thrive. So they're going to struggle and they're going to die off first. But guess what? The organisms that eat these guys tend to be generalist species, right? And as we lose these specialists, that means less food for these generalist species. And on top of that, they're also going to have less territory, much like the specialists, for them to live, roam, and hunt. And these organisms require a lot of territory. I don't know for sure, but I imagine, let's say an anteater can survive in this amount of space for its whole life. A jaguar, a boa constrictor, or a hawk is going to require like probably 10 times that. And the reason is because of the energy loss that we see with each trophic level. They need to be able to eat a lot more anteaters than an anteater needs to eat ants. But there are other anthropogenic threats besides just habitat destruction for farming that are going to threaten biodiversity. We could see habitat destruction via climate change, sea level rise, invasive species, something we'll talk about later on in the year, pollution, growth of human population, and just generally speaking, overexploitation of resources. And I have a picture of a hippo here because we use the acronym HIPPO to remember this, HIPPO. Uniquely are these areas in the globe we call biodiversity hotspots. These are areas where there is extremely high species diversity, habitat diversity, and genetic biodiversity. Rainforests are a great example, but there are also different areas, some areas of the chaparral, some areas on mountain ranges in Central America, and these areas are extra vulnerable because they have a lot more to lose. And so when these anthropogenic threats start encroaching onto biodiversity hotspots, we could lose a lot of biodiversity really, really fast. Why should we care, though? Who cares if we lose biodiversity? Well, like I said earlier, biodiversity is going to provide stability for ecosystems to prevent things like trophic cascades. It's also going to make them more capable of evolving, adapting, and recovering to disasters and other natural selection pressures. Additionally, biodiversity is going to increase resistance to emerging zoonotic diseases. A zoonotic disease is one that jumps from an animal, a wild animal, to a human. COVID-19 is a great example. Ebola, SARS, MERS are all zoonotic diseases that have emerged because the ecosystems in which they came from, the biodiversity went down. Combine that with increased contact with humans, and you're going to see a more likely emerging of these new diseases. Biodiversity also provides us with a variety of resources, food, medicine, materials, all that stuff comes from living things. And the more unique living things we have, the more resources we have to pull from. Like most medicine comes from trees in the rainforest. And a lot more. We'll explore this a little bit later in the unit with something called ecosystem services. But I want to hone in on this COVID-19 thing and the connection to biodiversity because it's pretty eerie how apropos it is. Here's a quote. The emergence of COVID-19 has underscored the fact that when we destroy biodiversity, we destroy the system that supports human life. The more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more difficult it is for one pathogen to spread rapidly or dominate, whereas biodiversity loss provides opportunity for pathogens to pass between animals and people. Continued, human actions including deforestation, encroachment on wildlife habitats, intensified agriculture, and acceleration of climate change have upset the delicate balance of nature. We have changed a system that would naturally protect us and have created conditions that allow particular pathogens, including coronaviruses, to spread. This is from World Environment Day, which is an organization that partners with the UN, non-government organizations, and various government organizations from around the world. And they are not the only ones to document this phenomena. A lot of the diseases that we've seen, a lot of the viruses we've seen in the past number of decades have come because of humans encroaching on natural habitat and reducing the biodiversity, increasing the likelihood that a disease is going to jump from an animal population to a human one. Okay, and last thing I want to talk about is how we measure biodiversity, right? How do we know that there are 2 million species on the planet? And how do we know that there are 333,000 species of beetle? Well, we have to measure it somehow. Some of the metrics that we use, species richness is a very important metric, and that is just a account of the number of unique species in an area, right? So the species richness of our classroom, if it's just humans, is going to be 1, because there's one species, humans. Species richness, if we had a class pet, like a cat, would be 2, because there are 2 different species. It doesn't matter how many humans or how many cats are in the room, it's just about the number of unique species. So take a look at this, see if you can determine which species or which community has a higher species richness. And it's a trick question. They actually have the same species richness. They both have 4 different species of trees. Okay, and another important metric we use is species evenness, which measures the abundance of individuals within each species. So if you take a look at this community on the left, it's not a very even community, because you've got this one sort of dark green tree, and there's a lot of that tree, but there's only like 1 of these other trees. So it's got a low evenness. It's not an even distribution of different species. Whereas this community, you've got like 4 or 5 of each different tree. It's much more evenly distributed with better proportions of each species. That's species evenness. Why don't you take a look at the same picture and see if you can determine which one has higher species evenness. Hopefully you picked community 1. If you take a look at the breakdown in this, we've got a quarter of each of all the trees. There are 4 species, and they each make up 25% of the trees. Whereas in this one, we see a lot of this tree here. 70% of them are this tree, and then smaller amounts of the other trees. So it's not as evenly distributed. But both of these come into play, right? So this community, despite these both having the same species richness, this community is going to be considered more biodiverse, because not only do they have the same species richness, but this one is more even. So you have to take evenness and richness into consideration when making this call. So given that, see if you can take a look at these 2 and determine which forest is more biodiverse. Okay, hopefully it was pretty easy. Community 1 is the best choice. We have a nice species evenness, 25% of the 4 species, whereas in this one it's very uneven, and there are 4 species of tree in each one. So the richness is the same, but the evenness is a lot better in the first community. Try this one. Which one is more biodiverse? Okay, this first community, right, we have a bunch of yellow mushrooms, so it has a low species evenness, but we've got 4 different mushrooms, so our species richness is 4. If you look at this one, we see 4 different mushrooms, species richness is 4, but the evenness much better distributed. So it has a higher species evenness, and ultimately it's going to have a higher biodiversity. So that's pretty much it. The questions I want to leave you with, next class we're going to do a lab measuring biodiversity, and I want you to think about how do scientists actually go out in the world? How do they actually go out there and measure biodiversity literally? How do they do that? How do they monitor the change in biodiversity over time? And then lastly, okay, how are they going to measure the biodiversity of an entire biome, like the whole desert, the whole rainforest? Or how do we know that the whole world has approximately 10 million species? How do we figure that out? So keep those questions in the back of your mind when you come to class next time. And I'll see you then.